introduce our next speaker because this is a homecoming for her. Amy is one of our graduate students, Amy Reed-Sandoval, and one of our graduate students of whom we are very proud. And so it's really great for us to get to show her off to the rest of the group today. She's now assistant professor of philosophy and the faculty affiliate of the Center for Inter-American and Border Studies at the University of Texas, El Paso. Her current research is situated at the intersection of political philosophy and philosophies of race and gender, with particular focus on Latin American and Latino-Latina identity and immigration justice. And she's working on a book entitled The Illegal Identity, Race, Class, and Immigration Justice, that explores the nature and implications of, quote, the illegal, or, quote, socially undocumented identity formation in the United States. So please join me in welcoming Amy back to the
Thank you, Bill, for that introduction.
Except the title of your paper is The Injustice of the Migrant Journey to the United States.
Okay. It's been a very nice homecoming. Many thanks to Bill and to Amos for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful event. It's been a very enjoyable experience listening to these terrific talks, and I'm honored to be able to present my work here. So yes, the title of my paper is The Injustice of the Migrant Journey. Can everyone hear me okay? Because I'm kind of tall for a standard podium, so I'll kind of wave, I'll just project more. All right. Across the globe, many people undertake journeys of different kinds in hopes of migrating with or without legal authorization to a country that is different from the one in which they currently reside. Migrant journeys involve planes, trains, buses, taxis, boats, and physical movement that can be grueling. They feature a variety of places where migrants may sleep, duck, run, hide, and seek refuge. They involve borders, deserts, street corners, waterways, and highways. Migrant journeys are often undertaken in the context of a web of social relations in which people call upon friends and family who have previously undertaken the journey. Migrants may befriend fellow migrants along the way and quickly develop new networks of love and support. Sometimes migrants undertaking the journey drown under capsized boats, become dehydrated, and starve to death. Migrants may be raped and assaulted by gangs, law enforcement, and even sometimes other migrants as part of their journey. Migrant journeys are also under-theorized, and they confound traditional theories of global and immigration justice. Those who are undertaking them are in transit, continuously moving from one state to another in a journey that may span several different sovereign territories. Thus, the normative challenges they present are not clearly accessible via the theoretical frameworks offered in the context of the philosophical open borders debate. For even if we settle the question of whether states have the right to maintain and defend national borders and implement certain policies of immigrant exclusion, settling in favor of either an open borders or a closed borders world, the question of what is owed to migrants who are currently undertaking, are intending to undertake, and or have undertaken a dangerous migrant journey still needs to be answered. My goal in this paper is to provide one normative argument about one oft-traveled migrant journey, that of Central Americans and Mexicans who intend to enter the United States without legal authorization by traversing Mexico, the Sonoran Desert, and the heavily militarized Mexico-U.S. border. I shall argue that this journey is a violation of justice in the scope of U.S. immigration policy. In so doing, I hope to provide the beginnings of a theoretical framework for assessing from a moral point of view a variety of migrant journeys on a local scale. So this is going to be very contextual, but I'm hoping that it has much broader implications. More specifically, I shall argue that the aforementioned migrant journey of many unauthorized, or better yet, soon to be authorized or intending to be unauthorized, we've yet to fashion an appropriate term for this status, Mexicans and Central Americans toward and sometimes into the United States via the Sonoran Desert is unjust because it plays a key role in the perpetuation of what I call illegal or socially undocumented identity in the United States. This is the subject of my current book project. So I use the term illegal identity to reflect the ways in which this identity is frequently described in common discourse, but I think that ultimately we should be using the term socially undocumented identity. So I kind of go back and forth. As a result, I argue the migrant journey also contributes to anti-Latino and anti-Native American racisms in the U.S. I further argue that the United States is required, as a matter of immigration justice, to take steps to render the journey of unauthorized Mexican and Central American migrants to the U.S. less perilous, violent, and inhumane. And I also fear Bill's trapdoor, so I won't go into the policy recommendations in such detail at the end, but I'll hint at them. So before I can argue that the migrant journey perpetuates illegal or socially undocumented identity formation in the United States, I must explain what I take this identity to be. So here I'm going to summarize the work that I've developed and defended in the context of this subject. So I've argued that a satisfactory account of undocumented migrant oppression should be able to demonstrate not only what undocumented migrant oppression is, but also why it is unjust within a closed borders philosophical framework. The reason that I do this, as Joseph Cairns points out in his recent book, is that certain problems, like undocumented migration, only become visible if we assume a world of nation states and borders, right? So if we just assume an open borders paradigm, undocumented migration as it occurs today is not going to be visible, so we have to make a certain set of assumptions. So the question that motivates my account is, how are we to understand the wrong of undocumented migrant oppression if we pragmatically assume within a closed borders framework that undocumented migrants don't have a prima facie right to live and work in the society in which they currently reside? So in answering this question, I have argued that it is necessary to distinguish between a usage of the terms illegal and undocumented to refer to a legal status, and a usage of these terms to refer to a social identity. That is, we need to distinguish between being legally and socially undocumented. To be legally undocumented is simply to reside in a state without having legal authorization to be in that state. But to be socially undocumented is to be presumed to be undocumented on the mere basis of one's appearance and treated as an inferior on that basis. So the terms of legal identity, once again, and socially undocumented identity refer to the same thing. But I would like to note, even we should be careful in using terms like illegal and illegal identity, because these terms are now something of a racial slur. So use them pragmatically with care. So note that within a closed borders framework, it is permissible for one to endure certain immigration-related constraints on the basis of being legally undocumented. So for instance, to borrow from, or rework an example from Michael Blake, if a citizen of France overstays his visa in the United States, the US government doesn't treat him unjustly in denying him the right to vote in US elections or to serve on a US jury. This is not a violation of liberal egalitarian justice. I tend to work within a relational egalitarian framework. I haven't gone over that for considerations of time, but this doesn't, in Liz Anderson's words, dominate, exploit, marginalize, demean, and inflict violence upon the hypothetical French citizen in question. However, I have argued, by means of particular reference to the US context, that it is oppressive and therefore unjust for one to endure certain immigration-related constraints on the basis of being presumed to be undocumented on the mere basis of one's appearance. For instance, many people in the United States report being harassed by police officers and immigration and customs enforcement officials, or ICE agents, not because of the fact that they lack legal permission to be in the United States, but because, to put it bluntly, they are taken to look like working class Mexicans. In addition to this harassment by police and ICE agents, these individuals may be condescended to and told to go back to their country by US citizens and hired for the most dangerous and exploitative jobs, among other things. Even if one lacks legal permission to be in the United States, I submit, it is wrong for one to be presumed to be undocumented on the mere basis of one's appearance and treated as an inferior on that basis. Such treatment does not represent justice in immigration. It is intersecting racism and classism, which constitutes impermissible treatment in a just and egalitarian society, even if people who lack authorization to be in the society in question. In sum, people who are subjected to immigration-related constraints not on the basis of lacking legal permission to be in the United States, legal constraints such as, again, not being allowed to serve on a U.S. jury, but on the mere basis of looking illegal, are socially undocumented. Now, allow me to explain this idea in just a bit more detail before I turn to the migrant journey. First, note that it is possible to be both socially and legally undocumented. That is, one can lack legal permission to be in the United States and endure certain just constraints on that basis, but also endure unjust constraints because one is presumed to be undocumented on the mere basis of one's appearance. Importantly, however, one can be socially undocumented, that is, one can have an illegal identity, even if one has legal permission to be in the United States. A great number of Mexican origin legal residents and citizens in the U.S., along with a number of other U.S. Latinos, have reported living in great fear of immigration enforcement despite having legal authorization to reside here. Second, note that socially undocumented or illegal identity is intimately connected to U.S. Latino identity, but it falls short of being coterminous with this identity. That is, not all U.S. Latinos have a legal identity. The socially undocumented, I have argued elsewhere, tend to be darker-skinned Latinos and Latinas who are also working class. The anthropologist Josiah Hyman published in 1988 ethnographic research conducted with a number of INS agents when the INS still existed. And he learned that immigration enforcement officials are accustomed to looking for visible class markers when targeting Latinos and Latinas for investigation. They noted that certain types of clothing and a certain demeanor enables them to, as one INS officer put it, spot the illegal in a group of Latinos and Latinas. Thus, in many contexts, lighter-skinned and upper-class Latinos and Latinas may not have illegal identities despite being Latinos and Latinas. Third, note that one need not be Latin American or Latino to have an illegal or a socially undocumented identity. In fact, many Native Americans living in the on the U.S. side of the Mexico-U.S. borderlands report that they are often treated like illegals. For instance, a number of Native American groups in Arizona rejected the controversial Arizona SB 1070 law on the grounds that it would lead to undue targeting of Native Americans who are presumed to be Hispanic. Key Allen Begay Jr., a Navajo Nation councilman delegate, said that, in a way, the immigration bill is an attempt to harass Native Americans. He added that, quote, when we are pulled over or stopped, we are usually pulled over and asked for our IDs. Sometimes we don't carry these things, and perhaps at that time we will have difficulty proving that we are Native American. He goes on to say, we were here before anyone else, before any white people, and now we're going to be questioned about being here illegally. End quote. In conclusion, I submit that socially undocumented or illegal identity is an ethno-racial and class-based identity that is intimately connected with but falls short of being coterminous with Latino or Native American identities. And I've noted that not all legally undocumented people are socially undocumented and vice versa. I have a lot more to say on that, so when my book is finally completed, you can check it out, and I hope you will. And so we can talk more about this. But I propose this notion of a legal or socially undocumented identity as a new way for thinking about justice and immigration policy, because now we can think about what sorts of immigration policies, what sorts of practices are in fact perpetuating this unjust identity. So this is the framework from within which I work. And with that in mind, I'm going to talk about the migrant journey. Okay, so now I want to just talk about the nature of the migrant journey that I'm going to be discussing. All right. Countless well as Mexicans and Central Americans seeking to enter the United States without legal authorization are routinely subjected to abuses and indignities over the course of their attempted journeys to the U.S. Some of these migrants are rendered additionally vulnerable due to their gender and sexual identities. For example, it was reported following a recent Fusion investigation that approximately 80% of Central American women and girls who attempt to enter the United States via Mexico are raped over the course of their journey. According to a 2013 study conducted by the Mexican National Institute of Public Health, approximately 36% of gay, lesbian, and transgender migrants who seek refuge in a migrant shelter, as well as 57% of those who chose not to stay in shelters, are violently and often sexually assaulted. I feel, in light of some of Trump's recent language, I feel uncomfortable talking about these sorts of issues, and as much as it contributes to certain stereotypes that he's perpetuating. So I'm trying to talk about these problems with care, because this is a serious issue that should be represented correctly. So as previously stated, I'm interested in this paper in the migrant journey that Mexicans, Central Americans, and other Latin Americans make into the United States via Mexico through the Sonoran Desert. So this is just, there we have the Sonoran Desert. Of course, for many unauthorized Central American and South American migrants to the United States, the perils of the migrant journey begin long before Mexico is reached. However, given that I'm concerned with possible obligations that the United States may have with regard to the perils of the migrant journey in the scope of immigration justice, I'm choosing to focus on a part of the migrant journey that is a direct consequence of U.S. immigration policy. I'm now going to explore. Many hardships that Mexican and Central American migrants experience in the Sonoran Desert en route to the U.S. are indeed unjust consequences of U.S. immigration policy, particularly in light of the Prevention Through Deterrence, or PTD, strategy that was adopted by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security in the 1990s. Prior to the adoption of PTD, it was customary for unauthorized migrants entering the U.S. via Mexico to enter through urban ports of entry, such as those of Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana. U.S. Border Patrol agents would wait until these migrants had crossed and then chase them into Latino and Latina majority urban areas, where they would often be confused with the, quote, legal resident Latino population. In those days, the migrant journey was vastly shorter, less violent, and less deadly. However, such unauthorized migrant crossings through densely populated urban areas brought about rampant law enforcement targeting of Latino citizens and legal U.S. residents in these areas. So this practice was therefore responded to with complaints from the local Latino population who were being harassed while going about their day-to-day activities. Following these complaints of racial profiling, in 1993, 400 U.S. Border Patrol agents were stationed between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez through what was called Operation Blockade. The goal of Operation Blockade was to deter unauthorized migrants from crossing in this urban area. This served to push the migrant stream out of the area. Due to the local success of this initiative, the U.S. government adopted Prevention Through Deterrence, a program that effectively militarized the Mexico-U.S. border along urban migration routes. This served and continues to serve to push unauthorized migrants into the Sonoran Desert. So as you can see, this new migrant journey is clearly a direct consequence of U.S. immigration policy. It wasn't always like this. It doesn't have to be like this. As the archaeologist Jason De Leon explains, quote, rather than shooting people as they jump the fence, Prevention Through Deterrence set the stage for the desert to become the new victimizer of border transgressors, end quote. Now many migrants wishing to enter the U.S. via Mexico must attempt to survive all of the potential dangers of the desert. In addition, now they often need to hire coyotes to find the safest route, and they are at risk of being violently attacked or kidnapped by smugglers in unpopulated regions of the desert. According to a conservative estimate provided by De Leon, quote, 5,596 people died while attempting to migrate between 1998 and 2012. And between 2000 and September 2014, the bodies of 2,771 people were found in southern Arizona, enough corpses to fill the seats on 54 Greyhound buses, end quote. And yet, most experts on the matter agree that PTD and related policies have not successfully lowered rates of unauthorized migration from Latin America. It is also important to note that prevention through deterrence in funneling migrants through the potentially dangerous and deadly Sonoran Desert is consequently funneling unauthorized migrants through indigenous land, particularly that of the Tohono O'odham. So here you can see the traditional Tohono O'odham lands, and then the red patch is denoting the Tohono O'odham reservation in the United States. According to some estimates by O'odham officials, approximately 1,500 unauthorized migrants attempt to gain entry to the U.S. interior via the approximately 70 miles of border that traverses the Tohono O'odham land between the Babokivari and Tumakakori mountain ranges. While this land plays a fundamental role in Tohono O'odham life, philosophy, and spirituality, it constitutes extremely rough terrain for migrants who are unfamiliar with it. As De Leon puts it, quote, "What's agonizing for the Tohono O'odham is that the American federal government has turned their sacred landscape into a killing field, a mass open grave," end quote. Not only are the Tohono O'odham burdened with the economic, health, and environmental costs of so much migration through their territory, they must also contend with the nearly 1,770 U.S. Border Patrol agents on their land, many of whom frequently treat the Tohono O'odham and other indigenous groups as illegals on or by their own territory. So this is the particular migrant journey that I'm focusing on in this paper. And now I'm going to turn to the task of arguing that this migrant journey is unjustly reinforcing illegal or socially undocumented identity in the United States. So this argument has two parts. First of all, I'm going to argue that it enforces illegal or socially undocumented identity. And second, I'm going to argue that this reinforcing is something that should be addressed through U.S. immigration policy. We'll tie this all together on some arguments. So there are three ways in which this migrant journey reinforces the belief that on the mere basis of their appearance, some people, those with a legal identity, don't belong in the U.S. and can be treated as inferiors. First of all, I'm going to point out that it's frequently used in anti-immigrant rhetoric that indicates that the journey is so immoral and or horrid that those who undertake it are consequently rendered unfit to be in the United States. Second, it is used in rhetoric that reduces the socially undocumented to the physical migration process itself. If the socially undocumented can be reduced to the movement aspect of the migration process, it is easy to present them as permanently unsettled and thus undeserving of membership in the United States. And third, much of the geographical terrain of the migrant journey is depicted as an anti-immigration weapon and not as the indigenous sovereign land that it is. This helps sustain the conditions through which Native Americans in the territorial U.S. are rendered illegals on and nearby their own land. Okay. So in preparation for these arguments, let's just begin by noting that there appears to be at least some connection between how someone arrived at the place that they currently are and their social standing in that place. So one is granted more prestige if one arrives at a party in a sports car than if one hitchhikes to said party, unless one's friends buy certain social conventions. So it depends on the party. So this connection can be noted on this admittedly less serious level, but it can also be noted in relation to the way that different immigrant groups are viewed. For instance, in the United States, it's a source of prestige to have an ancestor who arrived on the Mayflower, even though riding the Mayflower was probably not a very luxurious experience. Along similar lines in Australia, it's a source of prestige to, as David Miller puts it, have had an ancestor who was carried over in chains on the first fleet. So in sum, it's clear that the mode of arrival of an immigrant group can play, and indeed has played, a significant role in the social standing of that immigrant group and its descendants. So now let's explore how the mode of arrival, that is the migrant journey, plays a role in the way that the socially undocumented are viewed in the United States. First of all, it's frequently used in anti-immigrant rhetoric that indicates that the journey is itself so immoral and or horrid that those who undertake it are consequently unfit to be here. To begin to see why, let's note a fact about some Latin American migrant journeys to the U.S. that don't get mentioned in anti-immigrant rhetoric. In fact, many unauthorized migrants in the United States did not and do not undertake the migrant journey. Rather, they simply overstayed their visas. In fact, approximately 28% of undocumented migrants in the U.S. fall into this category. Many such migrants drove across the border at urban ports of entry in cars or in buses. Some take airplanes to the United States. And yet no one ever hears undocumented migrants referred to in anti-immigrant rhetoric as visa overstayers or drivers across the border or airport people. Right, these terms are not used. Instead, the only time that the migrant journey is discussed, the migrant journeys are discussed in anti-immigrant rhetoric is when they can be depicted as so horrendous that they can be used as part of an effort to express that the people who undertake them don't belong in the United States. Common slogans used by those who oppose Latin American immigration to the U.S. include expressions like, "Once you jumped the fence, you broke the law," and "Stop the invasion." In different ways, both of these slogans make reference to the migrant journey. Jumping the fence is an obvious reference to how some undocumented migrants enter the United States, while the term invasion refers to what is considered to be the aggressive crossing of a territory in different ways. Another example of how the migrant journey gets used in anti-immigrant rhetoric is that of the immigrant crossing sign that was commissioned by the California Department of Transportation in 1990 after over 100 undocumented migrants were killed by cars while darting across the border of San Isidro. I'm sorry, I got mixed up. This was the once they jumped the fence, they broke the law, and this is the migrant crossing sign. So the well-known sign features a man, a woman, and a little girl with pigtails holding hands and running. Many are aware of the fact that this image has in fact become iconic for many immigrant rights activists. But it's somewhat less well known that the image has also been adopted by many anti-immigrant groups. Sometimes the image is presented by these groups in its original form, and sometimes the running family is depicted being chased by a man with a gun. So that's a different interpretation of the sign. As we can see, the image of migrants desperately running, such a prominent feature of some migrant journeys, plays a significant role in anti-immigrant rhetoric and thinking. It is clear then that the Mexican and Central American migrant journey to the U.S. is being called upon and only being called upon when it can play a role in establishing anti-immigrant sentiment. It is clearly powerful from an anti-Latino immigration perspective to suggest that Latino immigrants should run away, get back behind the fence, be forced to run away from immigration enforcement officials, and be compelled to stop invading the United States. The migrant journey is depicted as immoral, dangerous, and horrible, in order to suggest that those who undertake it don't belong here. A second way in which the migrant journey is employed to reinforce illegal identity in the U.S. is through reducing the socially undocumented to the migration process itself, particularly in terms of the movement aspects of the migration. If the socially undocumented are constantly viewed as unsettled and in movement, the idea that they don't belong is reinforced. One important example of this can be found in the employment of the term anchor babies. And in fact, this is one of the most horrendous Google image searches to actually go through. This was the most kind of benign image that I came up with. This is a particularly problematic source of anti-immigrant sentiment. The babies of Latina migrants, along with other immigrant women of color who give birth in the United States, are sometimes referred to as anchor babies in sexist anti-immigrant rhetoric. The usage of this term presents us with a long list of moral problems, but it is particularly telling that the metaphor of an anchor of a ship is employed in describing Latina mothers and their children as though these human beings can be reduced to the movement of a ship into the United States and its eventual problematic anchoring there. A second example of the socially undocumented, or those with illegal identities, being reduced to the physical movement aspect of their migration processes and thus rendered intrinsically unsettled is so-called Operation Wetback, the actual term that was used. So implemented in 1954, Operation Wetback was an initiative on the part of the Immigration and Naturalization Service designed to apprehend and deport Mexican workers in the United States. The fact that an INS initiative officially contained the term wetback in its title is particularly illustrative of the connection between the migrant journey and anti-immigrationism. The term wetback or mojado in Spanish is a pejorative term that refers to the fact that some unauthorized Mexican migrants swim across the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo en route to the United States. In referring to unauthorized migrants as wetbacks, human beings are being reduced to a difficult aspect of the migration process itself. And third, much of the geographical terrain of the migrant journey is depicted as an anti-immigration weapon and not as the indigenous sovereign land that it is. This helps sustain the conditions through which Native Americans in the Mexico-U.S. borderlands are rendered illegals on and near their own land. As discussed previously, prevention through deterrence policies serve to funnel unauthorized migrants entering the U.S. via Mexico through the Sonoran Desert into Hono-O'odham land. Now the desert itself is frequently being used in propaganda distributed by the United States government in Mexican border towns, aiming to distinguish people from migrating. In this propaganda, the desert terrain is presented as dangerous and deadly. A harsh, blazing sun is often depicted, shining upon frightening desert animals and individual migrants suffering from dehydration. However, no mention is made in this anti-immigration propaganda of the fact that this is Tohono O'odham land being depicted here, with all the philosophical significance that this entails for the Tohono O'odham people. And lastly, note that the desert that migrants cross also gets employed in anti-Mexican rhetoric. For example, Jason De Leon has studied the ways in which migrant belongings that get left behind in the desert have, quote, become the physical evidence used by anti-immigration activists to demonstrate that Latino border crossers are destroying America, end quote. He cites one online commentator on an article about border crossings who wrote that, quote, Mexico is a dump and they, Mexicans, can turn anything into a dump, starting in our deserts and then the communities they settle. As De Leon points out, while some belongings that migrants leave behind in the desert can perhaps be categorized as refuse, quote, many of the things border crossers leave behind in the desert are valued objects not meant to be left behind, such as pocket Bibles, family photos, and love letters, end quote. So as we can see, even the objects that get left behind in the desert are used to assert that working class Mexicans and more broadly people with illegal identities do not belong in the United States. So to summarize, I've argued that the migrant journey reinforces illegal or socially undocumented identity in the U.S. in three ways. First, it is conveyed by anti-immigrationists as being so horrific and immoral that those who undertake it are not fit to be in the U.S. Second, anti-immigrationists employ imagery of the migrant journey to reduce the socially undocumented to the movement component of the migration process, rendering them perpetually and almost intrinsically unsettled. Third, the Sonoran Desert itself gets described by anti-immigration law enforcement and U.S. citizens as a trash heap and a dangerous and deadly anti-immigration weapon rather than as indigenous sovereign land. The migration journey we have seen reinforces the belief that the socially undocumented do not belong in the United States and can therefore be treated as moral inferiors. The socially undocumented are continuously rendered in the migrant journey discourse as unsettled and perpetually moving about in untoward ways. They are depicted as immoral as a result of making the journey. It is suggested that they are invading rightful victims of the desert sun, desert animals, and desert dehydration. They're depicted as being rightfully chased by people with weapons. All the while, it goes comparatively unmentioned, not only in anti-immigration rhetoric, but even in purportedly neutral discourse about immigration, that a very significant portion of legally undocumented migrants in the U.S. actually cross the Mexico-U.S. border in a plane or a car and simply overstay their visas. Clearly, that particular migrant journey cannot be employed so easily to belittle and humiliate Mexicans and Central Americans. In sum, in perpetuating so flamboyantly socially undocumented identity, the migrant journey clearly reinforces what is, in Elizabeth Anderson's words, quote, a form of social relationship by which some people dominate, exploit, marginalize, demean, and inflict violence upon others. So that's the crux of my argument. I do have more to say also in terms of thinking about how to overcome the injustices associated with the migrant journey, but that's my presentation.
Question.
Oh, I filled this one?
Hi, good to see you again. Great talk. Well, I really find it interesting and disgusting that anyone would even think of this particular region of the desert as a weapon. And I was wondering, could you say more about what indigenous people in the area have done to try to take back their land or assert themselves over their land, so it's become this mass grave, and what that one internet commenter disgustingly said is a dump. What have they done what have the indigenous people in the area done to try to make it less dump-like, or take back their land? Yeah.
It's been a source of great dispute amongst the Tohono O'odham. I should, Tony Lucero in Latin American Studies here writes on this issue, so he's a great person to talk about this. But there's been a lot of ethical debate amongst the Tohono O'odham about how to handle the situation. Obviously, they object to a lot of immigration policies enforced by the U.S. federal government, but their voices aren't given considerable uptake. So there are debates about how charitable the Tohono O'odham should be towards migrants who are crossing their territories, because there are environmental consequences. Obviously, people are just enduring a lot of dehydration and all sorts of pains, and it is a very difficult journey. And so some people think that the Tohono O'odham should go out of their way to put out big buckets of water for people to drink when they come through, and others say, well, look, this is the U.S. federal government's problem. We shouldn't be encouraging people to come through our land by putting out this water. So it's a very, there are a lot of different views from what I understand amongst the Tohono O'odham, and unfortunately attempts to have the U.S. federal government pay attention to their claims have been ignored. So I think Tony Lucero is an excellent person to talk about this, but it's a very kind of rich and complicated ethical debate.
First of all, I just want to say I appreciate your bringing to the attention of the group the work by Jason David. I think it's very important in terms of contextualizing the injustice is embedded in our migration policies. I guess the question I have for you is something you haven't touched on at all. You looked at the sort of issues for Latinos and sort of in contemporary American society, but what about the issue about privileging potentially? I'm asking a question for your point of view in regards to the justice issues. A number of people brought up both yesterday and today the whole notion of justice within migration policies. What about, and especially when thinking about, there was a discussion about, for example, Iraq. If a country commits violence, then that country, perhaps, or the international community, has a responsibility to take in refugees from that particular country. Well, in the case of Central America, South America, you have economic policy, foreign policy, NAFTA, that kind of thing, which has rendered economic turmoil and a lot of decimation of the economic order and sustainability in those countries, leading to violence, and there's militarization that we do you think there should be some kind of effort to address the injustice of our migration policy by privileging certain groups within Central America who have been the object of a lot of American foreign policy, which has been extremely detrimental?
Thank you for that question. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, kind of thinking about migration as a possible response to historical injustices or problematic foreign policies or economic policies on the part of the U.S. and other states. So I'm having read Toga's work on this question. I do just kind of as an empirical matter. I have questions about whether opening borders is the most effective means to respond to this history of abuse. But I'm certainly so that's why I haven't addressed it in the paper. Also because I wanted to think really about U.S. immigration policy in particular. So perhaps the U.S. government, surely the U.S. government has a lot of repair work to do with regard to its economic policies, but I really wanted to think about certain migration policies and injustices that are a direct result of U.S. immigration policy in particular. So that's why I fleshed out the story about how U.S. immigration policy generated the migrant journey. So not a very satisfying answer. It's just I limited the scope to U.S. immigration policy and its consequences, and I'm just very, very curious about whether more open borders is the most efficient response to resolving the legacy of these other sorts of human rights abuses. Michael, I gotta get my Michael question over with because it's gonna be a tough one. So have my energy.
I'm here for you. So I'm a little bit confused. I was expecting you to go a different direction as far as the justice claim. Because if the justice is found in the discursive conversation about race and ethnicity in the United States, then the people with the right to complain about this are all Latinos and Latinas. In contrast, I would have thought the people who have a right to complain are the dead ones, right? And that seems to be an entirely different matter. The injustice of the migrant journey, I would have thought, if the claim is made most powerfully, it's made on behalf of those people who are coercively pushed into an area that is in fact going to be deadly. And despite the fact that you have reservations about referring to it as a weapon, it's a damned efficient one if you're talking 5,000 to 6,000 people being killed. And I think there's going to be a sense that the moral story here is misplaced unless it makes that experience central. Because you could imagine a kinder, gentler form of this. So you don't have that sign saying, oh my God, it's terrifying. You have, oh, come on in. It's fine. This way to the US. And then you just rely on the desert to do your work. Now, of course, that still violates the land rights of the indigenous folks and so forth. But the solution to your version of the injustice looks towards racial repair within the United States, whereas I would have thought that the most powerful form of injustice would require a fundamentally different form of policy towards would-be migrants that has nothing at all to do with how race relations are lived in the U.S.
Thank you for the question. So there's a sense in which there are people who have, so many people, thousands and thousands of people who have literally died undertaking the migrant journey, and so it seems like I'm kind of distracting or deflecting from that incredibly serious human rights abuse and focusing. So I think that's a very fair point. I don't think that the fact, and clearly there's so much more work to be done on these migrant journeys, and I'm trying to generate one type of conversation about it. So I think that we do need moral language, and we need new concepts to be able, within dialogues about global justice, to be able to refer to those obvious, literally, deadly human rights abuses. But I still think that we need to be concerned about the ways in which the migrant journey is reinforcing socially undocumented identity. So this is something that my framework for thinking about the subject, I think my framework provides us with tools for identifying one aspect of the wrong. I understand your point that perhaps it's not even the most salient aspect, but I think that even if we found language to address that problem, this would still be a very valid kind of injustice that would require a response in the form of immigration policy.
I'm just thinking, and I want to build on Michael's question and your answer. I mean, I think they all go together because you're telling a story of dehumanization. So, I mean, in part, this harms Latinos living in the U.S. by lowering their social status and making them, degrading their social status. But of course, it also degrades the victims, and by sort of humiliating and demeaning and degrading the victims, then it seems that their suffering is worth less. I mean, there's a perverse way in which it reinforces these injustices.
Let me say, correct me if I'm not responding to your question or objection. My framework for thinking about socially undocumented identity, it's designed to give us a language for thinking about the rights of people who are not legal U.S. Legal Latino U.S. citizens and residents,
right.
And actually that's kind of contribution. So, for example, Michael has interesting work on saying, well, certain discriminatory immigrant admissions policies are problematic if they undermine the social standing of an existing group, in a country like the United States. And so, some people like Jose Jorge Mendoza have kind of used that to argue against certain immigration policies. And my approach is thinking, well, yes, it is harmful for people who are Latino and have a residency or citizenship in the U.S. But what about the people who don't have that status? And I think that I'm trying to broaden the conversation so it goes beyond U.S. Latinos to think about people with socially undocumented identities, which is this broader group. And I'm hoping that using that framework, we can also think about people who may not have even entered the United States yet, but already have this identity, and it's being perpetuated in a way that's an injustice. Does that respond to your, or not so much?
No, but it's great.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I really like this idea or this language socially undocumented. And I know that you were specifying the U.S.-Mexican border, but I'm wondering what care we should take if we want to universalize this identity or concept. There's the constant question that many people have to answer: where are you from? Even if their family has been generations in the United States, and it's put primarily to those people that don't have a European background. So, to what extent can we amplify this, and what are some problems in that amplification?
Thank you very much for that question. So I do think that this is a methodology that can be amplified, but it will always require a very contextual and what Bill would call a bottom-up analysis, given the location in which being conducted. So what I would say is in any given, we can take different borders of the world, right, on a global scale, and we can ask questions about what the process of illegal identity formation looks like in that case. So here in the US, someone who has an illegal identity is generally going to be someone who's taken to be a working class Mexican, right, who looks like a working class Mexican. But in different countries of the world, illegality might operate in a different way. But
how could we, excuse me for interrupting, but how could we say, for example, Asian Americans, and their need to identify themselves as Asian Americans, and comments about, go back where you came from, and those types of things that they might hear quite a bit, but it's not the same border. And can we make that same connection?
Yeah. So not even global, making it more universal just within the United States. Yes. Okay, thanks for that clarification. So first of all, I think that that there can be extensive analyses that go beyond thinking about U.S. Latinos and Native Americans who kind of live close to the Mexico-U.S. border. So I'm very open to that, and I hope to be contributing to what will eventually be a broader conversation about this. I do think, and as I develop my book, I do think that there is a role for thinking about Asian American illegal identity, particularly along the border. There's actually a history of Chinese Americans living close to the border being presumed to be working class Mexicans and treated as illegals, so I think there's space for that. In thinking about Asian Americans in particular, I like to follow Mei Nai's work, where she argues that the unique situation of Asian Americans is kind of being presumed to be foreign, right? Being presumed to be foreign in the United States, but not necessarily, she doesn't say this, but I don't take her as submitting that Asian Americans are presumed to be illegal. The idea is perhaps you're legally a foreigner in the United States. So this is why I haven't automatically been so inclusive, but I'm very open to precisely that type of dialogue, and I think it's urgently needed as this notion gets expanded.
Yeah, just a quick question. You talked a little bit about migrant journeys and the different ways in which people interpret and use them. So I'm wondering whether the narrative of the journey isn't important and about as part of thinking about our relation to migrants in a more just way. Is the actual, the competing narratives that people give. So there's actually the physical part of it, but you also gave all kinds of symbols and accounts that point to the ways in which the journey itself and the way people understand that journey is part of producing justice in the situation. Does that figure into your account in any way?
Well, that's a really good question. In a longer version of this paper, I make use of the book Enrique's Journey that some might be familiar with. That it's Enrique's a Central American migrant who attempts, and he's very young, and he attempts to cross the Mexico-U.S. border many times and endures a range of injustices. But your question that was produced by the journalist working with Enrique. So I take you to be saying, how about these first-person accounts of the migrant journey? And is that what you're asking?
Right. But part of the issues is, well, there are some accounts of it where the very story of how they do it, the process, the trash, and all these things, this is used to turn them into problematic citizens or proto-citizens, whatever it is. And they're presumably competing or counter-narratives that turn them into worthy citizens or worthy of respect, or however you want to do it. So, it seems that when you use the idea of a journey, that there is a built-in narrative structure that is also open to interpretation, and so the moral value of the migrant is also the site of contestation is the way in which the narrative of the journey is being constructed.
Thank
So
you
it's
for
just a
that.
thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great suggestion. I mean, at the end, I talk about possible responses in terms of ending prevention through deterrence and recognizing tohono sovereignty. But I think that creating a platform for alternative and more positive first-person narratives about the journey can kind of displace this sort of rhetoric could be a really important solution as well.
Well, I mean, it goes back to it goes back to the accounts you gave of how Australians turn the prison narrative into something positive, and as a marker of social status.
Mm-hmm.
And so these things can be used in multiple ways, and so there are all kinds of these things. So you actually raised that question for me at the beginning by giving these alternate accounts of how did you go to the party, how did you arrive, and I think those are actually really significant in immigrant societies like ours, of what those stories are like.
Thank you.
Anyway,
That's a
so-
great point. Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to hear your response to the following, and it has to do with the responsibility for these acts. I am not convinced that U.S. immigration policy is as clear as you present it. Actually, I want to suggest that it's actually very ambivalent and also counter-cyclical, meaning as unemployment rises in the U.S., policies become stricter, enforcement becomes stricter, and vice versa, right? And because the fact is that huge numbers of people come over, legally, illegally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when the policy starts getting too strict, and this is relative, of course, business groups like the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, farmers groups, restaurant groups will actually put pressure on Congress and the executive around questions of immigration and the enforcement of it, right? So what I'm suggesting here is that perhaps the responsibility for this is even heavier, because the immigration policies actually send two messages. There's this, but then there is also, well, we'll hire you, they're jobs, we need you, et cetera, which is not part of the official discourse ever, but it is in fact part of what happens and part of how policies are enforced. I just want to put that out.
I appreciate that. And I think there are two narratives, and one is about come and do our most dangerous and dirty work. And I think that if we think about that narrative in combination with kind of the migrant journey, right, it's creating conditions for heightened exploitation of this segment of the population. And that's a key part of socially undocumented identity, right, is it being presumed that you're the appropriate person to do some of the most awful jobs. So I agree, it is more complicated, and I actually think that adding on this second narrative that you rightfully point out to makes it even more apparent that the migrant journey is doing this damaging work. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for this great and very informative talk. I think I have a question on the starting point, which is probably giving back the question you asked yesterday after my talk. And you started kind of with this kind of carrots style argument. So kind of I might be in favor of open borders, but now let's assume we have a non-ideal condition, and in this non-ideal condition, another question, there's a right to have a border, to close a border. And so now I would like to know kind of what is given there at the beginning, and what's the normative kind of status of what you are saying. We know in the extreme case, David Miller thinks if there's a right to have a border, there's a right to shoot people who want to cross the border. So now I understood kind of three possible answers you are giving, kind of what the status of the starting point. The first would be kind of if there is a right to close a border and to have a border, it does not always already include rights to make use of this border in a certain way. So to use certain kinds of violence or to make it difficult to cross the border or so. So this could be one perspective I heard in some parts. The second one was a kind of, even if there is a right to close the border, and even if there's a right to use means of violence or whatever to protect this border, there are other normative obligations we are having, and Jamie was talking about the humanitarian dimension of it. So there are different sources. So kind of even if we have the right to do so, there are other kind of normative moral obligations we have to not treat people kind of trying to cross the border in certain ways. Mm-hmm. So then this would be a balancing question, mm-hmm. or something like the priorities. And then the third point is the whole sovereignty issue with kind of the Indians, the Native Americans there. And so here the issue could be, yeah, there might be a right to close borders and to use means of violence, but there's an older right Native Americans have to the sovereignty of their territory, and this should not be violated or harmed. So, what is the argument?
I confess that I liked options 1, 2, and 3. I would gratefully adopt all of them into my framework because I do. I think that the right to have borders doesn't entail the right to do and any form of violence one wants at those borders. I think that we should have more porous borders, certainly, but there are also issues of indigenous sovereignty that might entail kind of a different system of borders and their maintenance than the one that we're currently, having dialogues about. And you're right, there are other normative considerations that might trump, actually speaking of Trump, right, to trump the sorts of things that states can do to maintain their borders. So for example, the border wall that Trump wishes to create, I think that there's if you kind of think, I think the border wall would do a tremendous damage in terms of reinforcing socially undocumented identity. And you might think that even if states have the right to build such a wall, that the issue of socially undocumented identity formation would trump that. So maybe that's not philosophically satisfying, but I actually agree with points 1, 2, and 3. Does that get me into trouble in your view, or?
No, but then, and I had this similar discussion with your parents, then I don't really understand how you choose the starting point. Mm-hmm. Because in a way you are saying, so let's leave ideal theory and start with our real world. Yeah. But this, to me, sounds now like a normative kind of position, where you say, so I assume something normative is given, and now we have kind of an extra normative discussion about other issues that are coming out. Yeah. But then it's not related to kind of a social diagnosis or political diagnosis of the world.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, and so I'm not adopting an open borders position, but in saying that I'm going to assume closed borders, I don't want to be kind of just defending the status quo with regard to borders either. And so my hope would be that as more people are engaging in these types of contextual analyses, that we can articulate very clearly these alternative kind of normative starting points for thinking about borders that's neither kind of the old school closed borders position or the new open borders one. So I take your question as a challenge to kind of develop this clear additional alternative to the kind of the open borders and closed borders extremes. Thank you. Yes.
I was wondering if we cannot say to you, okay, injustice of border crossing, trying to determine what constitutes the injustice here is essential, but we could say that the most fundamental consideration here is to look at borders themselves as the starting point. Let me give you an instance. When the borders that were created by fiat begin to matter to the Yoruba in Nigeria, or the Yoruba that was, Yorubas that were in the territories considered to be Nigeria today, Benin Republic, and also in Togo. These are 3 different countries. So some of them, you know that most of these people we call African leaders today, many of them are older than the states they are leading. So they have relatives in most of these places. And borders, because of political activity, some have been banned from coming into some territories, and they have their families. You see clearly here that, first of all, the position of these borders was not negotiated. And the people trapped in these borders, by these borders, have not negotiated why they should be trapped here. You can't talk about social contract validly here. So now, why not begin by considering borders themselves as the ethical problem and say, we can construct a theory of justice that is realistic on the basis of what borders do. Because borders create social conventions, they create most of these injustices, social injustices, territorial injustices, and all these other kinds of things. So the crossing might be a dimension of some of these other problems, but rather it's just an extension of the problems that were created by those already constructed lines of separation.
That's a very powerful question. This isn't the first time that I've got that question, right? And so some things are sacrificed in making certain assumptions about borders in the world that we live in. So I think that the type of analysis that you propose is really important. I do try engaging that type of analysis in some of my other work, and I think it's very urgently needed. I guess that where I disagree with you is that kind of analysis can lead to what we can call a realistic immigration policy. So I'm more confident that we can campaign to end prevention through deterrence, for example, and change that aspect of U.S. immigration policy than I am that we can, eliminate the Mexico-U.S. border or kind of make these really radical changes to the way that border operates. So that's kind of. I guess so that would be kind of the point at which I disagree, and that I don't know if that kind of analysis is realistic. But I don't think that we should only be doing realistic philosophy of immigration. I think that Joe Karen's shows that you can have realistic and idealistic approaches to immigration. So I think it's kind of an open question at what point do one's proposals become too idealistic as opposed to realistic? I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think that the kind of analysis that you're proposing could generate realistic immigration policy? Because I'd be really interested to dialogue about that.
I go with the wisdom that I've always known, which is that where one thing stands, another thing stands beside it. That there is no one way to do anything whatsoever. So plurality of perspective is essential. But I think we also have to discover where the problem is. Whether or not we are idealistic or realistic, that is not, something that says we shouldn't find out what the problem is. Because in the end, if you have a wrong understanding of ISIS, for instance, you are never going to have a good policy of terrorism. Mm-hmm. So you have to understand the subject of the discourse. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that submits to the distinction between idealism and realism. Mm-hmm. And this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say for a great deal of U.S. history, the Mexico-U.S. border was extremely porous, right? And there was a lot of kind of free crossings, but there still was, in fact, a border, and it still was problematic for a number of reasons. And so I guess I see myself as kind of looking back to a time when there was a border, and I'm not in love with that border, right? But there was a time when conditions were far more humane, and we weren't dealing with the issue of thousands of people dying in the desert. So I think I agree with what you're saying, and I think it's a really hard question when we're doing immigration philosophy or any kind of applied philosophy to really contend with maybe a desire to produce support for policies that we want, and also a desire to kind of really get at the bottom of the problem. So I would like to engage in ongoing dialogue about that, because it's an important question. So thank you.
Thank you for your paper. It's so interesting. I really enjoyed hearing it and seeing the things that you were talking about. I think there are a lot of interesting questions, but I want to go back to Michael's point about the journey, because I also got kind of hooked in that idea of the ways in which the journey constructs the immigrant, or the identity of being socially undocumented. And I think I just wanted to find a couple of other things about that. I saw some links to Luciana's talk this morning about, and some of the conversations from yesterday about the position of the migrant in society, and how maybe the mode of arrival links to the reasons for coming. Mm-hmm. And in this case, and the way we so whether time is a factor, so we romanticize these more distant journeys, right? We can think about, so the ones you were talking about, but also we could, the arriving on the ship with the Statue of Liberty, we know this narrative, right? So it's even more recent than the Mayflower. We talk about categories, the boat people, we talk about as a category of people based on their mode of arrival, and that meaning has changed over time. I think about the Syrian refugees as sort of, and their particular journey and the harshness of that journey. So I think there's something really rich in there that I would like to hear you say more about, I think, in thinking about these other kinds of journeys and how they contribute to a particular, this social identity that you're talking about. And just the last thing that I wanted to say is I also think they contrast with this other set of, there's a backwardness maybe almost to this idea of this journey that's being forced upon this particular class of immigrants, right? That needs to be pulled apart. It's that dehumanizing and the difference between the overstays and the people that arrive by plane. So I think that that's a piece of it. But I also think there's a way that, I'm thinking of the show Survivor, right, or Spartan, or any of these things, where these journeys, like these heroic, the survival journeys are trivialized and rewarded in this strange celebrity way. So I just sort of wanted to throw that whole mix out there to say, I think you're really onto something with the journey and how that's connecting to the construction of the identity, and that there are a lot of pieces that I'd like to see you say more about.
Thank you. No, I think that's a really great challenge, and I'm kind of excited about thinking about alternative journeys and narratives, and I agree that would really help to move the piece along. So thank you. I will do that.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presentation, and I saw some connections with some other, like for example, you brought a lot of facts the way Uchenna did with his, which informed theory, which I think is very important, and beyond the realist, idealist divide. You also, the way you present those pictorial references and remind me of what Mahmoud was trying to do yesterday as well. So I think there's two different things that I learned. I see a lot of overlap, and that's very informative, and it may also be formative in what we do next. Maybe something we need to implement for the next conference. But then I saw some other issues that I would like to ask you about. I like the way you started presenting, okay, there are different ways of crossing the border, different status, they mentioned this. But let's take the example of that Guatemala. This person went through 1, 2, 3, 4 borders. If we include the fact of the Native American territory, is yet another border.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that affects the narrative or the journey, the narrative of the journey. So why does the U.S. border matters most on the other border, right?
Yeah.
Or what is the weight of that particular process of crossing that border different from the one crossing from Guatemala to Mexico, right?
Yes.
And so that's one thing. You seem to have indicated in some way that you seem to have a more ambiguous, you're okay with ambiguity and your porosity. And it seems to me that you're onto something here that I'd like to see. Maybe we have some more thoughts about that. It's not so clear cut, it's not binary, is a negotiable thing. Just one example. I remember when we were in Arizona working with folks there, even the Mexican or the Chicanos, they would look at the Guatemalans by their size and their ethnic indigenous identity. And say, oh, so even among those immigrants, there's some kind of stratification. So how do we deal with that?
Thank you very much. These are issues that I'm also thinking about as I develop this project. Again, it's sort of a similar response to the one that I gave to Michael Blake, in that I chose to focus on prevention through deterrence and this particular border crossing and this particular set of obligations. But you're absolutely right. The Guatemala-Mexico border, there are outrageous human rights violations occurring at that border, and you also see a similar, I think there's a similar illegal identity formation occurring kind of at that border with regard to Guatemalan migrants. So often Guatemalan migrants, as many people know, are trained to say that they're from Chiapas, Mexico, and they're supposed to learn Mexican slang because they're going to be targeted by Mexican immigration officials when they're making the journey. And so there's this kind of connection between indigeneity and illegality that's happening at the Mexico-Guatemala border as well. And so all I can say is that I think that we need more analyses of this sort, because I think that we have to really flesh out different aspects of these migrant journeys and think about what obligations different states happen to have. And so I think that maybe a next project could be thinking about Guatemalan migration across the Mexico border in particular. But I think that there are some very strong linkages there that might also be, that in fact are impacting illegal identity formation in the United States. So I agree that there is a broader picture here.
If I may ask very quickly,
Yeah.
one thing I thought Michael Rosenthal was going to ask that question, he didn't, so let me. It has to do with the journey and the narrative, because there's a whole tradition of talking about diaspora, right? And I think in a certain way, if you go back to the original border or lack of border, or the fact that there was just indigenous land, right? And the diaspora narrative is very powerful. And it has almost like a kind of a universal appeal. Many traditions, many groups in different parts of the world have used that. So is that something that, just throwing out there, is that something that maybe informs people going towards an old promised land, or I don't know. Is there, in your studies, do you see any people building that kind of, we're going there, maybe it's jobs, as Michael said, maybe is there anything that guides that process of moving forward towards something?
That's an interesting question, and I think is very connected to what Michael was asking about. So my own work on diaspora has pertained to Oaxacan indigenous transborder migrations, where you have Oaxacan communities, actually, in Oaxaca and in the Pacific Northwest as well, and there's constant movement and migration back and forth. And actually thinking about your question in relation to what Michael said, there is something of a counter narrative being developed within those communities about the migrant journey. I perceive it as maybe kind of privileging the migrant journey as a more kind of masculine source of pride, and I think that sometimes Oaxacan women aren't featured as prominently in these narratives, but the idea is that in making these sacrifices, you're kind of challenging the system and like standing up to the man, right? And there's a sense in which kind of the negative aspects of this journey can be reframed in a more positive way. So I've been starting to think about kind of gender in relation to that sort of narrative, but I just to kind of connect your question to Michael's, I think that thinking about the diaspora in relation to the migrant journey might be a very rich potential source of counter narratives to challenge what's been established. Thank you. Is there still more time? Or?
Oh yeah, you get some extra time.
Oh, I do? Yes.
So I now want to come back to the question of the counter narrative, right? And the two examples you gave are particularly interesting because these are the peoples who come to be seen as, and certainly see themselves as the local nobility, essentially, right? But there are other peoples along the way who have also constructed heroic narratives, right? So Eastern European Jews who come to the United States between about 1890 or around until 1950, really. When they arrive, they are this scum and filth, and they go through Ellis Island, which, by the way, was a horrible place. It's now romanticized, right? Yeah. And they tell this heroic narrative, and Latinos are doing that as well. So, and maybe that's because I'm way beyond that border, but local shopkeepers like Doña Judy says, "Somos los únicos que trabajamos." We're the only ones who actually do the work, right? And this, you're right, and this is actually, you will hear on the Spanish radio station all the time. Occasionally in Univision, they are more circumspect about this, right? Right. So I want to suggest that all of this, in fact, opens up that possibility, right? In addition, and this is sort of unrelated, and maybe more for Amos, the U.S.-Mexico border is an unusual border because it's perhaps the only, I'm going to hedge a little bit because it depends on exactly what you consider, but it's perhaps the only border between the global north and the global south. And at least if we take power into consideration, this is really different.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely, it's a very highly charged, highly politicized border, and I think that it merits very special attention. I definitely appreciate that. Thank you. And once again, I'm just very inspired by this opportunity to think about additional narratives about the migrant journey. So, thank you.
Well, I'll ask a question or a comment because I'm still a little bit shocked, and I'll tell you why. One of the things that I just sort of pay attention to is, and and I haven't even found a single exception to it. When you find a policy, like when you said Operation Wetback, that just floored me, because when you find a policy where the official name of the policy is a racial slur, and inevitably, it's really quite interesting, I think, that you don't even have to know what the policy is. What you know is it will be unjust, and in a kind of interesting, kind of subconscious way, the people themselves are aware of it. And so they have to dehumanize the targets in a way to deflect an awareness that otherwise this would be an unjust policy. So I'm wondering if, do you have any other examples too of policies like this? Because I can tell you, we can tell you, from, Germany, from policies towards homosexuals in the 1950s, towards Chinese, each time, what you find is they actually give an official, they don't just say, sometimes they'll say the Chinese Exclusion Act, but they'll actually give these things official names, which are basically, these are subhumans. And so it just, and it's very, very rarely in social sciences do I ever find an exceptionless generalization. So I'm still here struggling. But is this an exceptionless generalization that whenever they give them a name like this, that the policy, it may take 200 or 300 years before it comes to be recognized that the policy is unjust? And so I'm also wondering too, is that something that you could use in your argument? That actually, you see, in other words, it's one thing, you're talking about the victims and what they're, but I think there's this kind of recognition on the part of the victimizers, right? And that, anyway, I want to suggest to you, you might want to make that point with it, like the name of that policy.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, adding that additional context, I think, can make it stronger. And I'm sure that there are numerous other atrocious examples over the course of history that can be used to support it. So yes, I appreciate that. Thank you, Bill.
Okay, well, thank you very much.